In Daniel chapter 10, we saw that Daniel had a vision that disturbed him so much that he prayed and fasted for 3 weeks. Finally, a celestial figure, which we identified as the Son of God before he became flesh, came to Daniel, and now in chapter 11, he's going to tell Daniel what that conflict was all about. Now I want you to kind of grab onto your chairs here and stick with me, because we've got to go through some very detailed history in the next verses that we're going to be looking at. This detailed history is predicted hundreds of years before it occurs. Remember, this is back in the year 536 BC, and he's going to give us detailed information that will go all the way from the time he is until even the Messiah. Now, let's begin reading in chapter 11, verse 1. This is now this celestial figure talking to Daniel and telling him the future. Now, he's also going to tell him something about the past. In verse 1, and in the first year of Darius the Mede, I took my stand to support and protect him. Now you remember, this is the 3rd year of Cyrus, which is also the 3rd year of Darius. And the first thing that he wants Daniel to know is, Daniel, I was with Darius in his very first year when he came to power. When he put you, Daniel, into power as one of the 3 supervisors over the Medo-Persian Empire, or at least not over the Medo-Persian Empire, but the Babylonian area of the Medo-Persian Empire. You see, God was working to put Daniel into the political position that he got. We don't just get everything a promotion or a position of authority without God granting us that. We need to recognize that and give God the glory. And so he tells Daniel, Daniel, in the first year of Darius, I helped Darius when he tried even to save you from the lion's den. You see, God was with Darius at that time, and this celestial figure was with him. Jesus, before he became flesh, was actually operative, working on behalf of Daniel and the Jewish people, even in the first year of Darius. Now verse 2 says, Now then I'll tell you the truth. 3 more kings will appear in Persia, and then a 4th, who will be far richer than all the others. And when he has gained power by his wealth, he will stir up everyone against the kingdom of Greece. Now notice, he's telling first of all the next kings of the Persian Empire. Now who are these kings? You will notice on the chart on the screen that after Cyrus came Cambyses, his son. He began to reign in 530. Cyrus now reigned from 539 to 530 BC. His son Cambyses took over at the death of his father in 530, and he reigned to 522. Now that would be the first of these 4 kings that this celestial figure tells Daniel will appear in history. The second one after Cyrus is Smerdis. He was really a pseudo-Smerdis. He claimed to be the brother of Cambyses, Smerdis. He really wasn't. His name was Guamata. He began to reign in 522, didn't last very long, didn't even last a whole year. And then comes the 3rd king after Cyrus. That's Darius. Darius the First, the Persian. Now don't confuse this Darius with the Darius the Mede. Darius the Mede, he was the one that was over Babylon. This is Darius the First. He is a Persian over the entire Persian Empire. And he was the one who was in power when the temple was reconstructed. It was during his time that Zerubbabel finished the completion of the temple in Jerusalem. And he reigned from 521 to 486. Then the 4th king after Cyrus is Xerxes, sometimes called Ahasuerus. Now he is the husband of Esther. And when you read the Bible in the book of Esther, you will see this man's name, this king's name, Xerxes, mentioned. He's the one that saved the Jews from extinction. You remember Hamath had a plan to exterminate all of the Jews. Esther went in and made a plea on their behalf. And as a result of Esther's intercession, King Xerxes saved the Jews. Now he is this 4th king after Cyrus. He's the 5th Persian king, the 4th after Cyrus. Now notice what the scripture says this Xerxes will do. Now this is the husband of Esther. It says again in verse 3, it says, or no, verse 2, the latter part of verse 2, when he has gained power by his wealth, he will stir up everyone against the kingdom of Greece. Now, it is Xerxes who went in a battle against Greece. In 480 BC, in the Battle of Salamis, he fought against the Greeks and he was defeated there. Now, notice the very next verse in our book, Daniel chapter 11, it says, "Then a mighty king will appear, who will rule with great power and do as he pleases." Now you might think that he's talking about another Persian king, and that would seem to follow right after Xerxes, but as we study these ensuing verses, we'll see that this mighty king mentioned in verse 3 is Alexander the Great of Greece. Now, did he come in right after Xerxes? No, he didn't. Well, why then is he being mentioned at this point? Because this celestial creature is only looking at the main kings that will be coming. And the main king he centers in on here is Xerxes. And Xerxes fought against Greece. Now Greece is in the context. Who is this mighty king? Well, you can see the transition already to Greece. Since in verse 3 we have a mighty king arising, and in verse 2 the last word of that verse is Greece, it would be very logical to say that this mighty king is the king of Greece. That indeed he is. Almost all commentators are agreed upon this, and we will see then how this fits the Grecian Empire from here forward. Let's begin reading here in verse 3. "A mighty king will appear, who will rule with great power and do as he pleases. And after he's appeared, his empire will be broken up and parceled out toward the four winds of heaven." Now, do you remember that's what happened when Alexander the Great died? What happened? His empire was divided into 4 divisions. And so it went to the 4 points of the globe. Now it says it will not go to his descendants, nor will it have the power he exercised, because his empire will be uprooted and given to others. Did that happen historically? Indeed it did. You remember we studied that the Grecian generals killed his son. Now ordinarily when a king dies, who does the kingship go to? Well, it goes to his son. But here he predicts in the future that when the Grecian Empire is established, that after the king dies, Alexander the Great, it will not go to his son, it will go to others. Now, since we're at this point in the Grecian Empire, it follows then that these verses that he's going to discuss will be the period of the Grecian divided empire. And let's remember that, because a lot of scholars are trying to say, well, the king of the south is the United States, the king of the north is Russia, and they're trying to make it apply to our modern days. And when they do this, they're jerking it entirely out of historical context. Remember, there were 4 Persian kings, and after them arises this mighty king who will be Alexander the Great. And so when we come in verse 5 to the king of the south would be the king of the southern division of the Grecian Empire. And what was that southern division? Well, just look south of Palestine and you'll see it. It's Egypt. Now, how do we know that this is Egypt? Well, look over in verse 8. The king of the south goes up into the north and attacks the king of the north, and in verse 8 he brings all of what he captured back to Egypt. That shows that the king of the south is the king of Egypt. Ptolemy, one of the generals of Alexander the Great, is the one who got control of Egypt. Now, who is this king of the north? Okay, look in verse 5. In verse 5 it says the king of the south will become strong, but one of his commanders will become even stronger than he, and will rule his own kingdom with great power. Now, who is this commander of Egypt that gets a kingdom even larger than that of Egypt? Do you remember when we studied Daniel chapter 8? I pointed out that there were actually 5 Grecian generals of Alexander the Great, and they divided it up among themselves. But what happened? Antigonus, one of the generals, defeated another one of the generals, Seleucus, and ran him out. And he took over all of Syria and Babylon and Persia as his part. Now, Seleucus fled to Egypt, and Ptolemy of Egypt made him one of his generals. And he invaded Antigonus with Seleucus at the command of his armies, and they went back up in the north and defeated Antigonus. As a reward to Seleucus, Ptolemy of Egypt gave him that whole area up there, Babylon and Palestine and Syria, as a reward for his having conquered Antigonus. And that's the way Seleucus, one of the commanders in the Egyptian army, got a kingdom that was even larger than that of the king of the south, fulfilling verse 5 to a T. Now, can you imagine predicting that kind of historical detail hundreds of years before it occurs? How often would it happen that the commander of your army gets a kingdom bigger than the kingdom you have? That's very unusual, don't you think? And yet, here we find this celestial being, whom we've identified as Jesus Christ himself before he became flesh, telling Daniel in detail what will happen in the future. But you think this is historical detail? The rest of these verses even go in more historical detail. Look at verse 6. After some years, they will become allies. Now at this time, Seleucus and Ptolemy, they become friends, and their two sons then arise, and their two sons have an alliance of friendship together. Look what it says they will do in their alliance. It says that the daughter of the king of the south will go to the king of the north to make an alliance. Now what happened? Ptolemy II gave his daughter Berenice to Seleucus, who is the son of, or Antiochus, the son of Seleucus. He gives his daughter to him in marriage. And he thinks, hey, this is really going to seal our friendship, because now my daughter is going to be sitting on his throne. But that's not the way it turned out. Because what happened, Antiochus had to divorce his wife, Laodice, in order to marry Berenice. And Laodice did not take well to this. In fact, she became furious, and so what she did, she poisoned Berenice and killed her, and came back in and became Antiochus' wife again. And so what they thought was going to be all this friendship between Egypt and Syria turned out to be a motive of war and conflict. And so as a result, it all came to nothing. And that's what the verse goes on to say, and says in verse 6, she will not retain her power, and he and his power will not last. In those days she will be handed over together with her royal escort and her father and the one who supported her. And so as a result, all of this alliance through marriage came to naught. Now you talk about, again, historical detail. You give your daughter as a wife to another king, and then the wife that he divorces to get her poisons her, and it comes to nothing. Here is historical detail being predicted once again. Now you might ask yourself, why is he giving this kind of historical detail? There are two reasons. Number one, because this will greatly concern the people of Israel. You see, the people of Israel lived right between Egypt and Syria in the north. And every time Egypt went up north, they went across Israel. And every time Syria went south to Egypt, they ran across Israel. And Israel is kind of like a football field. I mean, every time they fight against each other, they run over Israel in the process. And as a result, Israel is tossed back and forth just like a football. And one time they're under the control of Egypt, and another time they're under the control of Syria. And they're just nothing but a political football being thrown back and forth in this great struggle. And that's the reason Daniel was so concerned for his people. They weren't going to have any independence. They would no longer be a nation of prestige. Instead, they would be political pawns in the hands of the king of Egypt or in the king of Syria, you see. And at the second time, the second reason that we're having this kind of historical detail is for the Israelites to know that even though they don't have their independence, God knew this was going to happen. Don't give up in your faith before God, because your nation is not the most important nation. You know, you may have the idea that because your nationality is of such that your nation is not really important in the world, and therefore God's not concerned about you. Don't you ever believe that, because God loves people of all nations. And if you love God, it doesn't matter whether your nation is important or unimportant. What it matters is whether you love God or not. And if you love Him, you are important before Him. Remember that. And that's what He wanted these Israelites to know. That even though the Syrians may be in power at one time and the Egyptians another time, you stay faithful to God and you'll be important, just like Daniel was. Here Daniel was. He was a captive in another nation. His nation did not have its freedom, but God loved Daniel and took care of Daniel. Remember that. He saves us on an individual basis, not on a national basis. But at the same time, this historical detail would give the Jews in the future reasons to believe in their God, because only God can write history before it occurs. And since He's written this kind of detail, be sure that whatever He says in the future will come to pass. Be sure to do His will, because it's the true will of God. Now let's go on down through this other historical detail. Verse 7. One from her family line. Now Berenice was poisoned, and now one of her family line, her brother, Ptolemy II, he will arise to take her place. He will attack the forces of the king of the north and enter his fortress. He will fight against them and be victorious. He will also seize their gods, their metal images, and their valuable articles of silver and gold and carry them off to Egypt. You know what he did? He went back up into the north and he killed Laodice because she had poisoned his sister. He went back and killed her, you see, in revenge, and he took all of the riches of Syria and brought them back to Egypt. You know, right now we have a lot of conflict between Egypt and Israel and Syria. It's been going on for centuries. And this is exactly the kind of thing that we're finding. The same thing continues to repeat itself. History repeats itself, doesn't it? As people fight against people. Now it says for some years he'll leave the king of the north alone. Then the king of the north will invade the realm of the king of the south, but will retreat to his own country. And his sons will prepare for war and assemble a great army which will sweep on like an irresistible flood and carry the battle as far as his fortress. So what do we have? Well, the king of Egypt has attacked Syria. Now what's Syria going to do? It's going to come right back and war against Egypt. And that's precisely what happens. As we read down through history, we see that precisely this happened. There was battle against battle, son against son, Syria against Egypt, and Egypt against Syria. Seleucus II, he was Antiochus II's and Laodice's son. He continued to reign over Syria, and he made an effort to invade Egypt in 240 BC, and he's defeated. You see, that fulfills verse 9 right here. And then later on, Seleucus III, he and his sons mobilized and assembled a multitude of great forces, and Seleucus III began warring against Egypt. All of this is written, by the way, in a book called Between the Testaments by Pfeiffer. If you want to see a detailed description of this entire history, that's a good little book to get, Between the Testaments by Pfeiffer. And he describes all of these battles that went on between the Testaments. Now, why between the Testaments? You see, the Old Testament canon ended with Malachi in around 400 BC. And from 400 BC on down until the time of Christ, there were no more Old Testament prophets. And all of this history occurred during this period of time. And we can then, and yet the Bible covers it. Here we have Daniel predicting in detail the period between the Testaments. So you see, the Bible wasn't silent about this period of time. The Bible predicted about this period of time in detail. And here we're actually reading about it. Now, as we continue to read, notice in verse 11, it says, "Then the king of the south will march out in a rage and fight against the king of the north, who will raise a large army, but it will be defeated. And when the army is carried off, the king of the south will be filled with pride and will slaughter many thousands. Yet he will not remain triumphant, for the king of the north will muster another army, larger than the first. And after several years, he will advance with a huge army, fully equipped." Now, I wish I had the time to explain all of this in detail, but what you can do, you can read the manual that will accompany this course, and I will have a detailed description in that manual of every one of these historical events. Because we only have 30 minutes in this class, I don't have the time to show you historically every one of these events. But I want you to look at that manual, and you will be able to read with time and patience every one of the fulfillments of the prophecies that are found here. Look in verse 14. "In those times many will arise against the king of the south. The violent men among your own people will rebel in fulfillment of the vision, but without success." Now he's mentioned the Israelites. Here he's talked to Daniel about his own people. Now that's the reason I told you the Israelites were right in the middle of all of this. Every time the king of the south invaded the north, they had to affect the Jewish people in between. And every time the king of the north invaded the king of the south in Egypt, they had to run over the Jewish people in order to get there. And this verse right here says that some of the violent men among your own people, some of the violent men of the Jews. The fact that they're Jews doesn't mean they're faithful people of God. They may not be all that faithful to God. And here were violent men among the people who were trying to fulfill the vision without success. It says in verse 15 that the king of the north will come and build up siege ramps, will capture a fortified city. The forces of the south will be powerless to resist. Even their best troops will not have the strength to stand. The invader will do as he pleases. No one will be able to stand against him. He will establish himself in the beautiful land. Now what's this beautiful land? That's the land that Daniel thought was beautiful. It was his homeland. It was the nation of Israel. And here is a king who will come down into the nation of Israel, into their land, and he will have the power, it says, to destroy it. But he will determine to come with the might of his entire kingdom, make an alliance with the king of the south, and will give him a daughter in marriage in order to overthrow the kingdom. But his plans will not succeed or help him. It's so interesting how history repeats itself. We've already studied where the king of the south, Egypt, gave his daughter, Berenice, to the king of the north. Now, the king of the north gives his daughter in marriage to the king of the south. And this is Cleopatra. Now, it's not the Cleopatra of the Roman times, but her name was Cleopatra. And the king of the north in Syria gave his daughter Cleopatra to the king of the south, one of the Ptolemies. And guess what happened? He thought, boy, I'm going to have inside information to Egypt from now on. My daughter is going to sit beside the king of Egypt, and everything that happens she can relay to me, and that way I'll be able to control Egypt. Well, you know what happened? His daughter Cleopatra sided with her husband on every issue. She didn't help her daddy one whit. And instead, she gave the king of Egypt information that helped him to foil all of the plans of her daddy. And as a result, all of his plans failed, you see. And so that just shows, you know, the best plans of men in mass don't work out. It depends on whether God wants it to happen or not. You can have all your plans, and you can have all the ingenuity and creativity in them, but it's God who determines whether they succeed or not. And that's the reason in James 4 it says, if it's God's will, we will do this or that. And if it's not God's will, it won't happen. We need to remember that lesson and not commit the same mistake that these kings were making in depending upon their own strength and their own wisdom to accomplish their own plans. Commit your plans to the Lord, Proverbs 16 verse 9 says, and they will be established. He's the one that determines this, and God, of course, will determine these as well. Now, if you notice in verse 20, we now enter into a section of this history that becomes very important to the Jews. It says his successor will send out a tax collector to maintain the royal splendor. In a few years, however, he will be destroyed, yet not in anger or in battle. And he will be succeeded by a contemptible person who has not been given the honor of royalty. He will invade the kingdom when its people feel secure, and he will seize it through intrigue. And then an overwhelming army will be swept away before him. Both it and a prince of the covenant will be destroyed. And after coming to an agreement with him, he will act deceitfully. With only a few people, he will rise to power. And when the richest provinces feel secure, he will invade them and will achieve what neither his fathers nor his forefathers did. He will distribute plunder, loot, and wealth among his followers. He will plot the overthrow of fortresses, but only for a time. Who are we talking about right here? We are talking about Antiochus Epiphanes once again. We have now reached that period of history where Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the same little horn of Daniel chapter 8, has appeared in history. It seems that all of these events have led up to him. And from here to the end of the chapter, we're concerned with Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, why has he given so much attention to this man once again? He already talked about him in Daniel chapter 8. Because this was one of the most difficult periods of Jewish history. We've already seen in Daniel chapter 8, 2,300 days of persecution, 6 1/3 years of tribulation, 6 1/3 years of difficulty and anguish and agony of soul, and seeing the temple desecrated, and seeing your children killed because they were circumcised, seeing people thrown into the fire because they believed in God, seeing Babels destroyed as he did. Did you know that King Antiochus killed anyone if they found a Babel in his home? That's the terrible man that he was. And so these kings have been shown in succession up to this man in order to once again point out that when he comes, don't give up on God. Don't think that his God is stronger than your God because he's persecuting you. You know, a lot of people think that when they're suffering, God has left them. They think that if they're suffering, God is punishing them. Now, sometimes that's true. It is sometimes true that when we're being punished, God is punishing us. Or when we're suffering, that we're being punished by God. But that's not always true. Think of Job. Job suffered so much. He lost all of his family. He lost all of his wealth. and he lost his health. And his friends came to him and said, Job, what did you do wrong? You're suffering because of your sins. Well, the Bible says Job was the best man around. He wasn't that bad. Why was he suffering? Because Satan was trying him. Satan was tempting him. Satan had told God, sure, Job serves you. Look how much wealth you've given him. Look what a great family he has. Who wouldn't serve you under those circumstances? Take his family away from him and see if he'll serve you. Take his wealth away from you and see if he'll serve you. That's the way to test him. And so God said, do it to Job. He did it. And Job did not give up on God. Now, when this time of persecution comes, what do you think the people are going to think? They're going to think, hey, this guy's God is greater than our God, or we're being punished, or God has abandoned us. No, don't you believe it. You stay with God. If you'll rely on Him, He'll strengthen you, He'll protect you, He'll help you. And even if you die during this tribulation, you'll be blessed, because He'll take you to heaven to be with Him, you see. And that's some of the promises we're going to be seeing given to the Jews during this terrible period of tribulation. But as we read on through here, notice what happens. In verse 25, it says, with a large army he will stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south. The king of the south will wage war with a large and very powerful army, but he will not be able to stand because of the plots devised against him. Now, do you remember when we were reading in the book of Maccabees? Here I've got it again. 1 Maccabees chapter 1. What does it say that King Antiochus did? Well, let's read it once more. It said in verse 16, when his kingdom seemed secure, Antiochus proposed to become king of Egypt, so as to rule over both kingdoms. He invaded Egypt with a strong force, with chariots and elephants, and with a large fleet to make war on Ptolemy, king of Egypt. Ptolemy was frightened at his presence and fled, leaving many casualties. The fortified cities in the land of Egypt were captured, and Antiochus plundered the land of Egypt. Now, there you can see, he plundered Egypt. And that's what we had here before, is that he's going to invade the south, Egypt, and he's going to conquer it, which he did, you see. Now, as you read 2 Maccabees, you find that actually Antiochus invaded Egypt 2 different times. And here we have the second time being mentioned. Notice in verse 25, with a large army he'll stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south. Then look at verse 26. Those who eat from the king's provisions will try to destroy him. His army will be swept away, and many will fall in battle. And the 2 kings, with their hearts bent on evil, will sit at the same table and lie to each other, but to no avail, because an end will still come at the appointed time, and the king of the north will return to his own country with great wealth. But his heart will be set against the holy covenant, and he will take action against it and return to his own country. Now that's where the Jews come in again. After he invaded Egypt, what happened? You'll remember what 1 Maccabees says. On the way back home, he entered Israel, went into the temple, ransacked the temple, destroyed many people of the city, and left them in misery. And that began the persecution of the Jews. Now, that's exactly what we studied in Daniel chapter 8, and now we find it being repeated here in Daniel chapter 11. And he's going to continue to talk about him all the way to the end of this chapter. And in our next lesson, we will sum up the rest of this chapter and then go into chapter 12 and see what the solution is. Because in Daniel chapter 11, we see the problem. In Daniel chapter 12, we find the solution.